Hello everybody, my name is Professor Charles Szymanski. I'm from the University of Białystok Faculty of Law, and I'll be talking in this lecture about international labor law. Many people may ask, what is international labor law? What are we talking about here? Most of the time we talk about Polish labor law, American labor law, but international law is a bit different. Some key terminology we need to go over before we get into the material a little deeper. Labor law itself, what does that mean? And that means, in a general sense, everything. Everything to deal with labor law and employment relations. So that would be the umbrella term for labor law. Union management relations deal with labor unions and how they interact with employers. Employment law traditionally deals with non-union circumstances, non-union environment, when you're dealing as an individual with the employer. Most aspects of labor law, as I mentioned, are domestic. That means if you work in Poland, then most of the time, the vast majority of time, Polish labor law will apply to you. And so where you work is the country in which that labor law system will apply. With globalization, there's been an increased interest in making sure that everybody around the world, everyone, has at least some basic minimal labor standards. With globalization, many areas of production and manufacturing have moved from Europe and North America to Southeast Asia, especially, and other countries where there are less robust tradition of labor law. And so what international labor law is about is making sure that globally we have higher labor standards. And there are different ways of accomplishing this. One way is to study comparative law. And that might be just looking at labor law systems in general in specific countries, and we could take what works in their system and maybe apply to other countries, or to apply it even at a global level. So it's really trying to find what works best and maybe using some elements of that and applying it globally. One aspect of that has been disability law, disability rights law in the employment context. And the basic principle of disability law and employment is that you help people with disabilities and give them accommodations. So if they need to reschedule their hours a bit, they need to work on the first floor as opposed to the top floor, they need a special seat. Basically, the employer is obligated to help them. And that is an idea that could and has been exported throughout the world. Otherwise, besides comparative studies, we could look at some actual international aspects of labor law. Most of it's domestic, but there are some purely international aspects. One of that is from the International Labor Organization. And that was created in the aftermath of World War I, and for the interesting idea of helping world peace. And the idea is that if workers are starving and they have really bad conditions, they're going to cause problems, and even this may lead to revolution. So we want workers to be taken care of and have good working conditions and at least some minimum standards. More recently, the ILO has focused on some what they call core standards throughout the globe. This is the right to join a union and collective bargaining, no discrimination, no child labor, no forced labor. More recently to this has been added safe working conditions. And the idea is that these are not necessarily economic. You should have a right to be not discriminated against if you work in Southeast Asia, just as you work in Poland or the United States. It doesn't cost the government or an employer anything additional not to discriminate against people. So this principle and these other principles can be applied even if it's a very poor country or it's a very rich country. And the idea of the International Labor Organization is to get everybody on board to follow at least these minimum standards. Another possibility is trade unions. Trade unions are more powerful in Europe, somewhat less powerful in the United States, but they still have an important role. And the idea is that they too could have a role in improving labor standards throughout the globe. Globalization affects corporations and businesses. They're mobile, they can move from one country to the next. And labor unions themselves are also becoming more mobile, not to the extent of business, but they're trying. One of these things that they could do to help is something called a framework agreement, and they take those core ILO principles that we've just discussed earlier, the right to join a union, no discrimination, no child labor, no forced labor, now safe working conditions, and they get employers in Europe especially to agree to these principles if they move their locations or production to countries which have no or very minimal labor standards. So the idea is to take some of these North American and European levels of protection and ensure the basics are protected in operations throughout the world. Another aspect is called corporate social responsibility, or CSR, and this is that the company voluntarily does the right thing and treats workers fairly. This concept many of you may have seen when you use cosmetics in the morning or various creams or something, not tested on animals. That's what the label may say, and that's a form of corporate social responsibility. The company doesn't have to do that. They can test their products on animals, but they do it because maybe it's the ethical thing to do, but also as a form of marketing. Maybe a lot of people are concerned about animal rights and they want to buy a product that protects them. And so the same principle would be applied to labor rights internationally. If a company could say that they're treating their workers in Vietnam and Indonesia, in places where they have their production, responsibly and fairly, this may lead people to buy their products, and in fact, perhaps, the companies could even charge a bit more for their products, as we see in the case of coffee, for example. You might pay a little bit more to get a socially responsible coffee. And they've done this through various methods and codes of conduct and certifying their products as labor-friendly. Sometimes we've seen the term fair trade, and this could be a labor label that they treat the workers well, and also an environmental label that they haven't used toxic chemicals or pesticides, for example, in this coffee product. So this is about marketing. It's a positive development. A disadvantage may be about that it's not binding. It's just really a voluntary company program, and they basically enforce it. Consumers enforce it by their buying decisions, and it's not a form of hard law. There are also other kinds of what we call soft law standards, not enforceable law, not enforceable directly. One of these are called the United Nations Global Compact, and they have certain sustainable development goals. And if we look at these goals, many of them are connected to labor, the right to decent work, no poverty, to end hunger. These are related to decent conditions at work, right? You have to have a minimum type of wage or income so you're not hungry and your family is not hungry. And as you see before you, these are done in like an app format, so younger people could easily identify with them, and companies can too, and making sure, are they sustainable, are they socially responsible? And the United Nations has set these goals in a very kind of clear format so companies and consumers can check. There's also disclosure laws. Companies may have to, not just voluntarily now, but we see in California and the UK in some aspects with forced labor, they may have to disclose whether they've checked to see if their products were made by slaves or people in forced labor conditions. And again, this information would be accessible to consumers. Consumers could decide if they want to buy something that may have had forced labor in their supply chain. International trade law also has labor considerations to improve standards for workers throughout the world. These are in free trade agreements with the European Union and also the United States, countries with relatively good labor standards. And what they basically say is, yeah, you could sell your products to us. We have a lot of consumers, we'll pay a lot of money, but you have to have decent working conditions for your workers. And these might be the core ILO standards we talked about, or they may be something a little bit extra than that. But basically the condition is, we give you free trade and you make sure your workers' labor standards and working conditions reach a minimum level. Well, I hope that's been helpful. I thank you for your attention, and I invite you again to the next lecture from the University of Białystok. Thanks again.